In the early 60s, you guys, the Beach Boys and the Beatles, were very kind of competitive.
It was kind of like a rivalry.
The Beatles were number one. We were number two.
We've got to get there before they do.
Rubber Soul got me Pet Sounds, and Pet Sounds got them Sgt. Pepper.
We were Pet Sounds. Before Pet Sounds, we were already stealing.
I wanted to try to top it.
Try and top each other all the time.
I felt competitive with the Beatles.
It may be a fairly well-beaten dead horse by now. Everyone knows the Beatles and the Beach Boys were competitive during the mid-60s, and people have been comparing the two for their entire careers. The Beatles versus the Beach Boys. Most people come to the consensus that, while the Beach Boys released a few great albums, they were essentially a germination of the 50s-era doo-wop vocal groups, while the Beatles transformed music, reflecting the psychedelic latter half of the 60s. One stuck to a formula, both in music and fashion, while the others became immortalized as icons of musical advancement and individual self-expression.
But I haven't waxed my board yet! You should have thought of that sooner! Let's go!
But it's not that simple. If you're interested in music history and merely scratch the surface, you'll learn that there's a lot more nuance to the common narrative, and you have to look past the fact that the Beatles were a lot more successful and famous. Like, a lot more. Even the Beatles themselves seem to have been flabbergasted at their own success.
We were copying imported music, but we didn't think we were like doing anything important. It was only when the sort of writers start saying, well, they've got an aeolian cadence here and a pentatonic cluster.
Oh, pentatonic cluster?
Get away!
Ah!
We got some of them.
And he said you had unresolved leading tones, a false modal frame ending up as a plain diatonic.
What?
What has occurred to you as to why you've succeeded?
I don't know, really.
It's important to understand just how different the early environments of both these bands were. Where the Beatles were these scrappy, almost Dickensian street kids, the Beach Boys were beaten under their tyrannical father Murray to always be musically perfect.
As the days grew old and the nights passed into time.
Quit screaming and start singing from your hearts, huh? You're doing fine now. Watch your oohs. Come in on the low notes, Mike. Carl, ooh, you're Come on. Dennis, you're flatting. Okay, Mike, you're flatting on your high notes. Let's go. Let's roll. So you're big stars. Let's fight, huh? Let's fight for success. Okay, let's go.
Whereas the Beatles always reminds me of that movie Little Rascals.
Now, we knew E and we knew A. It was quite easy, but we didn't know B7.
Pretty different cloths to be cut from.
So, on we got on the bus, trooped across Liverpool, changed a couple of buses, found this fella, and he showed us.
You kids get to sleep or I'll beat the hell out of you.
He needs to beat me.
But to compare these bands strictly along harmonic lines would be a mistake. Indeed, what the early Beatles may have lacked in professionalism, they made up for in their authenticity. They seemed like genuine friends.
Do you find any difficulty in keeping up your public image?
No. What image?
It's our image is just us, you know, as we were. We didn't try and make an image. It just happened, and so we don't have to keep it up. We just remain ourselves. Don't we, Ringo?
Now, to be fair, to say the Beatles were not concerned at all about their public image would be untrue. Certainly Paul McCartney is famous for being one of the greatest PR men who ever lived. But we'll get more into that later. The history of rock is murky, but if you want to break down the timeline, the Beach Boys' first album, Surfin' Safari, was released by Capitol about a year and a half before the Beatles ever appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in America. So you have to wonder, did the Beatles hear surf music before they came to America? And what did they think of America's current #1 band?
On the west coast of America, a new sound was born, the surfing sound. It was a tremendous rage over there, and it's been quite a big success here too. The boys who invented it are making their first television appearance in Britain on Ready, Steady, Go. Here they are with their big hit number, I Get Around, the Beach Boys.
Round, get around, I get around, yeah. Get around, I get around.
So we were inspired by Beach Boy kind of things.
Made my heart come on.
Already stealing stuff off them. All that la 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 la.
It was very humbling, because we had been
on top there, you know, for that year or so before.
When the Beatles came along, Brian, you have to admit there was a little bit of
I was jealous as hell. I was so jealous. Were you jealous? No, I wasn't. I was in awe.
Brian Wilson found the music of the Beatles fresh and challenging. The competitive streak Murray had instilled in him took over.
So all these crazy kids ever think it was the Beatles.
First, go back where they came from. You mean England?
No, under a rock.
I know it really challenged us in a way.
The race was afoot.
I knew we were good. I knew we were good at it, but I didn't, not until the Beatles hit, then we really felt like we had to get going. You know, because they were like going like crazy, you know. So we stepped on the gas.
Wipeout.
When we started to hear the Beatles' music, it struck fear in every American musician's heart.
And I always think it must have been so weird for the bands that were already big in America to suddenly have all these British people coming over and showing them how to play American music better. Meanwhile, the Beatles were doing the opposite and getting really into Bob Dylan and the folk scene, which brought them back to their early days in Liverpool as a skiffle band. But skiffle was just a British reimagining of American Appalachian music in the first place, and it's too meta! I'm not going down that rabbit hole. Okay, but moving along to the actual rivalry as it exists on the record. The year was 1964.
Rubber Soul really was a matter of having all experienced the recording studio, having grown musically as well, but mainly having experienced the studio and knowing the possibilities.
We always wanted every single record to have a different sound. We never wanted to get trapped in this the Mersey beat.
It's one of my favorite albums. I think it's a great album.
Brian Wilson liked it too. He actually became obsessed with it.
When I first heard it, I flipped. November of '65, at my house in Beverly Hills, my friend goes, I want you to listen to this album by the Beatles. Blew my mind, just totally took my mind away.
He's a real man, sitting in his nowhere.
I thought to myself, God, they're so good and I feel competitive about this. I said, I want to make an album like that, where all the songs seem to be like a collection of folk songs, you know? I wanted to try to top it. I felt competitive with the Beatles. You know, it's a funny thing, it's funny, but I felt competitive with it.
Hilarious. But I realized that before we can go much further, we need to talk about this guy, Beatles producer George Martin. Often considered the fifth Beatle, it was he who not only brought a musical sophistication to the sessions seated in both jazz and classical music, he also served as the band's physical producer, manning the control room and often translating the band's far-out ideas into practical, doable production approaches.
As where the Beatles had George Martin and John and Paul wrote the songs together, Brian was kind of like a one-man
You wrote
team.
most of the songs?
Yeah, I did. Most of them I wrote by myself. Back then it meant a lot to me, because, you know, like I was like very nervous, you know, because I didn't want to fuck up on the production.
Brian was obsessed with recording the perfect album, one that was better than the Beatles' masterpiece, Rubber Soul. The quest galvanized his ambition. Brian's obsessive desire to trump the Beatles led to his greatest work.
When we were beginning to work on Pet Sounds, Brian and I both talked about Rubber Soul.
That's Tony Asher. He did help Brian, but only with the lyrics.
And said, let's try to do that. Let's try to put the bar up there where this album had put it, you know.
Or an album that would be a rival to Rubber Soul.
Months and months of re-recording.
He's talking only about the vocal sessions. For only one song.
Run, run, with baby, there wouldn't be a single thing we couldn't do.
But somehow Wouldn't It Be Nice made the grade.
It's like this.
And instead of the Beach Boys themselves actually playing any instruments, Brian instead hired a bunch of LA studio musicians who offered him both the variety and precision to explore different styles from exotica to baroque.
Pet Sounds is probably the most significant album of our generation.
But if you're at all familiar with my channel, you already know how much I love this album. But what did these guys think of it?
I took an acetate of Pet Sounds to England before it was released, and Paul McCartney came by. Watching the two of them listen to that and say, I'll take that one, I'll take that, oh, there's a great riff.
Pet Sounds album from the Beach Boys. Pet Sounds, the whole album.
It flipped me, still does actually, still one of my favourite albums of all time. Just because the musical invention on that is like, wow. Well, that was the big thing for me. I just thought, oh dear me, this is the album of all time, what the hell are we gonna do? So my ideas took off from that standard, and I wanted to do stuff beyond that.
It gave the Beatles great inspiration, and it gave a challenge to them too.
John and Paul called me after they heard Pet Sounds and told me how much they liked it. It was quite an honor for me.
I think it was Carl's house at the beach. Somebody's birthday. And Paul McCartney was there. He was invited and did come by, and he and his wife. And he said, well, Brian, this morning I was driving along Mulholland Drive, playing Pet Sounds on me stereo or whatever. I think he said, Pet Sounds on me stereo. Tears in me eyes. Tears falling from me eyes.
Oh, Mike Love, you're so creepy. But the Beatles were quick to fire back with their next entry.
Keep in mind I wrote text, man.
Revolver is typically seen as the spiritual follow-up to Rubber Soul.
That really underscores the point of why Revolver was so important, because there you have the Beatles firing at all four cylinders, all fully engaged, and all of them on the same page, and wanting to make the best possible Beatle music there could be. It's sort of them easing into the next phase of their career with this album that is largely comprised of material that you could not reproduce on stage.
It also marks the period of McCartney really starting to take over as leader of the band, as Lennon's interests were beginning to be pulled in all different directions.
McCartney would provide the group's artistic direction for almost every post-Revolver project.
And with McCartney comes a kind of pop-conscious hesitation, a kind of populist conservatism.
I mean, if we just suddenly did exactly what we'd want to do, in fact, I think actually at the moment that is what we want to do, what we've done on Revolver. But if we did like all the way out things, if we did a whole album with them, then we'd be doing what like the people who do electronic music do. They go too far out too suddenly, and no one stays with them. Everyone else is left behind because they're miles out ahead, sort of digging all this electronic stuff. But in fact, what we've tried to do is like do the last album, Rubber Soul, a bit more towards that, then this one a bit more, and the next one should be a bit more. And if people stay with us, you know, it's great.
Apparently, the vibe of Wouldn't It Be Nice crept into here, there, and everywhere on the Revolver album.
I don't know about that. But it's clear that the Beatles, nor the rest of the music world, weren't done ogling the pop triumph of Pet Sounds. They continued their attempts to top it.
Because of the work they'd done, it didn't seem too much of a stretch for us to get further out than they'd got.
Quick side note, people compare Pet Sounds and Sgt. Pepper so often that this guy even made an entire mashup album called The Beatles.
I had to prove that I could make it alone now, but that's not me. I wanted to show.
Yeah, I agree.
You can do some research and then find out for yourself, oh, I see why Pepper has this particular flavor, because it was really being driven by Paul McCartney and George Martin, who were really working together very closely. Lennon was being dragged along and would contribute well when you could engage him, but he was really deep into his acid phase at that time. And then you've got George, who's sort of withdrawing from the whole rock and roll thing at that point. Here's the Beatles' lead guitarist who's writing songs on keyboard that year and really sort of forsaking his guitar duties. Paul's taking them up throughout the album while George studies Eastern mysticism and sitar.
This is the first exercise, I think.
So it's pretty clear where Paul and George Martin got the inspiration for the production approach for Sgt. Pepper.
This intensive approach to recording was another influence picked up from the American psychedelic scene.
The idea that it's possible to, really spend time in the studio and experiment and explore. Brian Wilson was doing that with Pet Sounds, and Paul sort of picked that baton up as well.
All right, here we go then. We'll send the tape. Are you ready, Richard? Just coming.
Marshalling the band was veteran producer George Martin.
Okay, Jeff. Yep. All right, here we go.
Who turned the studio into the LP's final instrument.
George was brilliant at that. It was like a schoolmaster and we were school children,
Sgt. Pepper, it was a catalyst.
Brian set his sights even higher. He started composing an album called Smile and promised it would be better than Pet Sounds.
Smile is experimental music.
Let's all record in the bathroom. Let's get into the shower and set up a mic. Let's all lay on our back in the studio and try it this way.
Beautiful. Now it sounds like jewelry. Here we go.
When the track surfaced up, I just did this hand to hand, and that's what he wanted.
But again, the Beach Boys were on tour, and they came home and they found these songs that he wanted them to sing that bore absolutely no resemblance to anything that seemed like, you know, normal life. Heroes and Villains and Van Dyke Parks wrote these songs that were just oblique, to say the least. The famous line that caused Mike Love to blow his top was in the song Evanescence. What the hell is this? Like, what could this possibly mean?
We don't want to sing about that shit.
But Brian was having a lot more problems than uncooperative bandmates. He was getting into habitual daily drug use, and he was starting to become severely detached. He was beginning his infamous downward spiral. Now, it was during this time that the Beach Boys and the Beatles shared a publicist, and there are two famous stories of Paul and Brian meeting during this downward spiral period.
I remember going over to Derek's house one night and getting a bit stimulated.
Yeah, sure.
Brian comes over, and he's got these shades on.
Yeah.
And he's, you know, he'd gone into his sort of nervousy phase. He was still a little bit. He had these shades on. He said, do you mind if I keep these shades on, man? I said, Brian, it's your life, baby. You keep the shades on. I love those shades. They look great. Anyways, do you mind if I play you a record? I go, no, that'd be great. And he plays Good Vibrations, like you've never heard it before.
Yeah.
And you're in the room with Brian, and he puts it on.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
that was the first time you heard it?
Magic. Yeah. Sometimes you get those magic little moments.
And the other encounter was again because of their publicist, Derek Taylor. Interesting how important this encounter seems to have been to Brian and his wife, but Paul actually has no memory of it. And it's on. But Brian never really finished Smile, and he was having a lot of problems that made him unable to keep up with his musical rivalry with Paul.
In his entire career, no album had ever taken so long to finish.
Paul McCartney was there. When are you going to do another album like Pet Sounds, Brian?
If there was still a musical arms race going on, Brian was beginning to be aware that he was losing, because even the Beatles' post-Sgt. Pepper material was blowing his mind, while he struggled to keep up.
I was on Seconal, you know, those kind of pills, downers, and I was real relaxed. When Strawberry Fields came on the radio, I locked in with it. I locked right in with it, and I had to pull over to my car over to the side, listen to it, and I said, I've never heard anything like this in my life.
And he just shook his head and he said, they did it already. I said, they did what? He said, what I wanted to do was Smile. You know, maybe it's too late.
This fellow who Paul McCartney and Sir George Martin and John Lennon and Leonard Bernstein call one of the true American treasures is behind the counter selling ginseng and vitamins.
Maybe it's too late. And I just started laughing my head off. And he started laughing his head off. So I always, you know, I never gave that much import to that. But the moment he said it, he sounded very serious.
It's a sad moment to imagine, and it does seem the race was over, because you can't deny that the White Album, Abbey Road, Let It Be, they're all great albums, continuing the Beatles' legacy, whereas the Beach Boys never really released anything that came close to Pet Sounds or Smile. Yeesh. And yet there are some who still contest that these two albums are more complex and exploratory than anything the Beatles ever put out. But personally, I try not to get too wrapped up in some fictional scoreboard of musical ingenuity. Comparisons are tricky. Obviously, both groups were made better by the other, and I choose to acknowledge their work in tandem, not in contrast. The two have appeared together many times, usually for press events, sometimes performing. They don't seem to be close friends or anything, but their mutual respect is obvious, and it's great to see the two geniuses still supporting each other. And when asked, they've always been upfront, even eager, to talk about their mutual influence. Here's a clip of them being cute.
Good to see you, Paul. Give me a kiss. All right. No tongues. Okay. I'm sorry, man. It's okay. I'll draw a line. All right, I want you to enjoy the next one. Oh, for you. You're just so good. You know, Brian Wilson sort of proved himself to be like a really amazing composer.
Yeah.
And I was into chords and harmonies and stuff at that time. And we ended up, it's kind of like a rivalry.
Yeah.
We'd put a song out, and Brian would hear it, and he'd do one, which is nice. It's like me and John. You know, you kind of try and top each other all the time. He eventually came out with this God Only Knows.
That was Pet Sounds, Tom, right?
On Pet Sounds, yeah. I just think it's a great song. Melody, harmonies, words. Do I like his melodies? Yeah, I love his melodies. Are you kidding? I think he was versatile. I think what he does is he threw a whole bunch of different kinds of songs at you, and we're supposed to figure out where they're all coming from. You know, I mean, he was very, very versatile as a singer and a songwriter.
We'd like to ask you if you'd join in with us.
Join in.
Join in.
I've always talked to Brian. I've been a huge fan.
Yeah.
You know, if anyone ever asks me what's your favourite song, other than yours, I say, God Only Knows. You know, just it's so mystically, magically put together. It's just a brilliant piece, you know. So he knows I'm a big fan of his.
Yeah.
And our birthdays are very similar. I think he's June 16th and I'm 18th or something.
Hello. Hi, Paul. It's Brian Wilson here.
Brian, how are you doing? It's wonderful to hear from you.
It's your birthday.
He knows I love him.
Yeah, okay, but so there was no tension between, No.
No, not really, no. Not at all.
The 60s, particularly, he wrote some music that, when I played it, it made me cry. And I don't quite know why. It wasn't necessarily the words or the music. There's just something so deep in it that there's only certain pieces of music can do this to me. And it just reaches right down in me. And I think it's a sign of great genius to be able to do that with a bunch of words and a bunch of notes. And this man, he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, that's for sure. So thank you, sir, for everything you've done for me, for making me cry, for having that thing you can do with your music. You just put those notes, those harmonies together, stick a couple of words over the top of it, and you've got me any day. Ladies and gentlemen, Brian Wilson.
Keep in mind, I wrote text, man.
And keep in mind, I'm on Patreon now because I'd love to quit one of my jobs and do nothing but give you guys new videos. So feel free to visit me there. Otherwise, stay tuned for the next one. Thanks.